The Mediterranean waters turned black beneath the hulls of invasion ships, as Lieutenant Colonel William Darby pressed his binoculars against the bridge railing. September 9, 1943 would mark America's first major landing on European soil, and the silence before dawn felt heavy with destiny. Behind him, thousands of American soldiers from the Fifth Army gripped their rifles, their faces pale in the pre-dawn light as they prepared to storm the beaches of Salerno. Major General Mark Clark had chosen this stretch of Italian coastline carefully. The Gulf of Salerno offered wide beaches suitable for landing craft, but it also presented a deadly challenge. The surrounding hills provided perfect observation and firing positions for German defenders. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had anticipated this very landing, positioning his forces along the high ground with methodical German precision. As the first light of dawn broke across the water, the invasion fleet revealed its massive scale. Over 600 vessels stretched across the horizon, carrying not just American forces, but British troops under General Bernard Montgomery's Eighth Army. The plan, codenamed Operation Avalanche, represented the Allies' bold gambit to knock Italy out of the war and establish a foothold in Hitler's fortress Europe. The naval bombardment began at 0330 hours, sending shells screaming toward the German positions. The thunder of 16-inch guns from battleships like the USS Savannah echoed across the water, their muzzle flashes illuminating the darkness like deadly lightning. German artillery responded immediately, their 88mm guns finding range on the approaching landing craft. With terrifying accuracy, Sergeant Tony Viscusi of the 36th Texas National Guard Division crouched in the bow of his Higgins boat as machine gun fire began raking the water around them. The young men from Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas had trained for this moment, but nothing could prepare them for the reality of combat. Water splashed over the sides of their landing craft as German mortars began falling among the invasion fleet. According to contemporary accounts from the New York Times correspondent covering the invasion, the German response was swift and devastating. Enemy positions that had remained hidden during reconnaissance now revealed themselves. With murderous fire, the carefully planned timetables began falling apart. As landing craft struggled through increasingly rough seas under constant bombardment, Captain James Earl Rudder of the 2nd Ranger Battalion watched his men load their equipment as their transport approached Red Beach. The Rangers had been assigned to capture key positions behind the beaches, but first they had to survive the landing. German Messerschmitt fighters screamed overhead, strafing the invasion fleet, while the light Spitfires and Thunderbolts engaged them in desperate dogfights above the landing zones. The moment of truth arrived as the first wave of landing craft ground against the sandy shores of Salerno. Ramps dropped with metallic clangs, and American soldiers charged forward into a storm of machine gun fire. The Germans had prepared their defenses well, with interlocking fields of fire that turned the beautiful Italian beaches into killing grounds. Young Americans fell by the dozens in those first crucial minutes, their blood mixing with the Mediterranean surf as they fought to establish the foothold that would begin the liberation of Europe. The Battle of Salerno had begun, and its outcome would determine whether the Allies could maintain their grip on European soil or face another Dunkirk-style evacuation. The morning sun climbed higher over Salerno Bay, revealing the full scope of the Allied assault as American forces fought desperately to expand their precarious foothold on Italian soil. Colonel William Darby's Rangers had managed to secure several key positions along the rocky coastline, but German resistance was proving far more intense than intelligence reports had predicted. The Hermann Göring Panzer Division, supported by elements of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, launched immediate counterattacks against the expanding beachhead. Private First Class Robert Henderson of the 45th Infantry Division pressed himself against the seawall as German artillery shells exploded in the sand behind him. The Oklahoma native had dreamed of seeing Europe, but not like this, not with machine gun bullets whining overhead and the screams of wounded men echoing across the beach. His unit had landed at Yellow Beach and was now fighting house to house through the seaside town of Paestum, where every window seemed to hide a German sniper. General Mark Clark established his command post just inland from the beach, coordinating the complex operation while German shells fell dangerously close to his position. The landings were proceeding according to plan in some sectors, but fierce resistance at key points threatened to compress the entire beachhead into a narrow coastal strip. Radio reports from forward units painted a grim picture of German Tiger tanks moving down from the hills, their thick armor immune to most American anti-tank weapons. The British 10th Corps, landing simultaneously to the north, faced similar challenges as they pushed toward the port city of Salerno itself. German defenders had prepared the urban areas with particular care, turning every building into a fortress. Street fighting erupted throughout the morning as British commandos and regular infantry units battled through rubble-strewn streets against determined Wehrmacht soldiers who knew every alley and rooftop. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill, no relation to the Prime Minister, led his commandos in a daring assault on German positions overlooking the harbor. The eccentric officer, famous for carrying a longbow and broadsword into battle, directed his men with characteristic unconventional tactics. His unit's success in silencing several key machine gun nests allowed follow-up waves to land with reduced casualties. Though German mortars continued to exact a heavy toll, naval gunfire support proved crucial during these early hours as destroyers like the USS Schuppich moved dangerously close to shore to provide accurate fire against German strong points. The risk was enormous. German coastal artillery had already damaged several Allied vessels, but without this support, the infantry would have been overwhelmed by the intensity of enemy defensive fire. By midday, American forces had established a beachhead roughly 8 miles wide and 3 miles deep, but at a terrible cost. Field hospitals set up in hastily dug positions behind the beaches overflowed with casualties as German artillery maintained constant pressure on the landing zones. The smell of curdite and blood mixed with the salt air as medical corpsmen worked frantically to save lives under fire. Major General Fred Walker, commanding the 36th Infantry Division, found his Texas National Guardsmen facing their baptism of fire. Against some of Germany's most experienced troops, the division had trained extensively in North Africa, but the ferocity of German defensive tactics shocked even veteran non-commissioned officers. German 88mm guns, positioned on the commanding heights, could engage both Allied armor and landing craft with devastating effectiveness. The afternoon brought news that would test Allied resolve even further. German reinforcements were moving south from Rome, including elements of elite SS units that had gained fearsome reputations on the Eastern Front. Field Marshal Kesselring was clearly determined to drive the Allies back into the sea, and his forces were positioning for a massive counteroffensive that could decide the fate of the entire invasion. As evening approached on September 9th, American and British forces clung to their hard-won positions, while German artillery continued its deadly work. The success of Operation Avalanche hung in the balance. Dawn on September 10th, 1943 brought no relief to the beleaguered Allied forces at Salerno. German artillery had pounded the beachhead throughout the night, and now Field Marshal Albert Kesselring launched his carefully planned counteroffensive. Designed to drive the invaders back into the Mediterranean, Panzermark IV tanks, supported by deadly Tiger tanks, rumbled down from the hills in coordinated attacks that threatened to split the Allied beachhead in half. Colonel James Gavin's paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division, who had been dropped behind enemy lines during the night, found themselves fighting a desperate battle to disrupt German communications and supply lines. The young paratroopers, many experiencing combat for the first time since their successful operations in Sicily, discovered that fighting in mainland Europe presented entirely different challenges. German units were better equipped, more experienced, and fighting on familiar terrain. The most critical threat developed in the center of the Allied line, where German forces identified a dangerous gap between American and British positions. General Heinrich von Weidenhoff's 10th Army launched a massive assault with over 100 tanks and self-propelled guns, supported by concentrated artillery fire that shook the ground for miles. The attack fell primarily on positions held by the 36th Infantry Division, whose citizen soldiers from Texas found themselves facing Germany's military elite. Staff Sergeant Audie Murphy, though not yet the most decorated soldier in American history, distinguished himself during these dark hours by single-handedly holding a crucial crossroads. Against repeated German attacks, the young Texan's actions, using a damaged tank destroyer's machine gun, allowed his unit to maintain their position long enough for reinforcements to arrive. His courage under fire would become legendary, though at the time, he was simply another scared soldier doing his duty. Reference to contemporary war correspondence from Ernie Pyle, who landed with the invasion forces, described the desperate nature of the fighting. German attacks came in waves, with each assault seemingly more determined than the last. American soldiers, many of whom had never seen combat before Salerno, learned the harsh realities of warfare against experienced Wehrmacht veterans, who had survived years of fighting on multiple fronts. The German offensive reached its climax when panzer units actually broke through Allied lines and advanced to within 2 miles of the beaches themselves. For several terrifying hours, it appeared that the entire invasion might collapse. Landing craft that should have been unloading supplies instead prepared for emergency evacuation of wounded and essential personnel. General Mark Clark seriously considered withdrawing his forces before they could be completely destroyed. Naval gunfire once again proved decisive as Allied warships moved to point-blank range to engage German armor directly. The cruiser USS Philadelphia fired over 1,000 rounds in a single day, her gun crews working in shifts to maintain continuous fire support. Destroyers like the USS Edison actually sailed into water so shallow that their hulls scraped the bottom, bringing their 5-inch guns to bear on German positions with devastating accuracy. The afternoon of September 10th witnessed some of the most intense fighting in the Mediterranean theater as German and American forces engaged in close combat throughout the beachhead perimeter. Tank battles raged across the coastal plain as American Sherman tanks rushed ashore despite ongoing enemy fire, engaged German Panthers and Tigers in deadly duels. The superior German armor and guns gave them significant advantages, but American tank crews fought with desperate courage, knowing that failure meant the destruction of the entire invasion force. British forces under General Richard McCreery faced equally intense pressure, as German mountain troops, specially trained for the difficult terrain of southern Italy, launched attacks from unexpected directions. The complexity of the Italian landscape, with its ancient terraces, stone walls, and countless hiding places, favored defenders who knew how to use every feature to their advantage. By evening, the situation remained critical. German forces held commanding positions overlooking much of the beachhead, their artillery observers able to call down accurate fire on any movement below. The question was no longer whether the Allies could advance inland, but whether they could hold their positions long enough for reinforcements to arrive. September 11th, 1943 dawned with the sound of aircraft engines as Allied air power began arriving, in force to support the embattled troops at Salerno. General Dwight Eisenhower, watching developments from his headquarters in North Africa, had ordered every available aircraft to support the invasion forces. American P-38 Lightnings and Republic P-47 Thunderbolts streaked overhead, engaging German Focke-Wulf fighters while dive-bombing enemy positions in the hills surrounding the beachhead. The arrival of the 82nd Airborne Division's remaining elements provided crucial reinforcement at the most desperate hour. General Matthew Ridgway's paratroopers, veterans of the Sicily campaign, brought not just additional manpower, but invaluable combat experience. These hardened soldiers had learned to fight German forces effectively, and their presence stiffened the resolve of less experienced units who had been wavering under the intense enemy pressure. Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, commanding Allied naval forces in the Mediterranean, made a bold decision that would prove decisive. The battleship HMS Warspite, despite the risk from German bombers and submarines, moved into the Gulf of Salerno to provide direct fire support with her 15-inch guns. The massive warship's shells could reach targets 12 miles inland, effectively extending the range of Allied artillery beyond anything the Germans had anticipated. Captain William Sample of the USS Savannah coordinated the naval gunfire support that was keeping German armor at bay. His cruiser, along with her sister ships, had expended thousands of rounds since the invasion began, but ammunition was running low. Supply ships fought their way through German air attacks to reach the invasion fleet, their crews showing remarkable courage as they unloaded under fire. Several transports were sunk during these operations, their crews and cargoes lost in the dangerous waters off Salerno. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, continued its relentless attacks on Allied shipping and beach positions. Junkers 88 dive bombers screamed down from the mountains, their sirens adding psychological terror to the physical destruction they wreaked. American anti-aircraft gunners, many of them recent recruits from farms and factories, learned their deadly trade under fire as they fought to protect the vulnerable landing areas. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley arrived to assess the situation personally, bringing with him the promise of additional reinforcements. The experienced commander, who would later lead American forces in Normandy, recognized that Salerno represented a crucial test of Allied ability to establish and maintain a foothold in occupied Europe. His recommendations to Eisenhower resulted in the acceleration of follow-up units, originally scheduled to land days later. The most significant development came with the commitment of additional British forces from Montgomery's 8th Army advancing from southern Italy. These battle-hardened veterans had fought across North Africa and Sicily, developing effective tactics against German defensive positions. Their arrival would provide the manpower necessary to not just hold the beachhead, but begin expanding it against determined enemy resistance. As referenced in official U.S. Army historical records, the period from September 11th through 13th marked the turning point of the Salerno operation. The combination of massive naval gunfire support, increased air cover, and fresh reinforcements gradually shifted the balance in favor of the Allies. German forces, despite their tactical superiority and better positions, could not sustain their attacks against the growing Allied strength. Technical Sergeant Leonard Funk of the 82nd Airborne demonstrated the kind of individual heroism that was becoming commonplace among American forces. During a German night attack on September 12th, Funk's actions in organizing and leading a counterattack helped secure a key position that had been in danger of falling to enemy assault troops. Such leadership by non-commissioned officers proved crucial in maintaining unit cohesion. Under extreme stress, the psychological impact of successful resistance began to manifest itself in improved morale. Among the Allied forces, soldiers who had been pushed to their limits discovered they could not only survive German attacks, but fight back effectively. This growing confidence, combined with superior Allied logistics and air power, set the stage for the next phase of the campaign. By September 13, 1943, the character of the Battle of Salerno had fundamentally changed as Allied forces began their first coordinated offensive operations. Since establishing the beachhead, General Mark Clark, sensing that German attacks were losing their intensity, ordered limited advances designed to expand the perimeter and link up with British 8th Army units advancing from the south. The tide of battle was finally turning in favor of the Allied invasion force. The arrival of the 3rd Infantry Division under Major General Lucien Truscott brought fresh troops and aggressive leadership to the American sector. Truscott's men, nicknamed the Rock of the Marne for their World War I service, had gained extensive combat experience in North Africa and Sicily. Their disciplined advance through the difficult terrain around Salerno demonstrated how much American forces had learned about fighting German troops. In the Mediterranean theater, German resistance remained fierce, but signs of strain were becoming evident in enemy operations. Field Marshal Kesselring's forces had sustained heavy casualties during their failed counteroffensives, and ammunition shortages were affecting German artillery support. The Wehrmacht's tactical doctrine relied heavily on concentrated firepower, and without adequate shell supplies, German defensive positions became more vulnerable to Allied assault. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former president and at 56 the oldest general officer to land at Salerno, led by personal example as he moved among frontline positions encouraging his men. His presence in forward areas during combat demonstrated the kind of leadership that had built the American Army's fighting spirit. Roosevelt's 1st Infantry Division, the famous Big Red One, spearheaded several key attacks that secured vital objectives inland from the beaches. The integration of Allied air power reached new levels of effectiveness as ground controllers learned to coordinate close air support with advancing infantry units. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, armed with rockets and bombs, provided devastating attacks on German strongpoints that had held up Allied advances for days. The psychological impact on German troops, who had enjoyed air superiority for most of the war, proved almost as important as the physical destruction inflicted by Allied aircraft. Naval gunfire continued to play a crucial role as Allied warships refined their techniques. For supporting ground operations, the destroyer USS Schubrick developed innovative methods for engaging German positions in mountainous terrain, using forward observers to direct fire with remarkable accuracy. The ship's 5-inch guns could reach targets that traditional artillery could not engage, providing infantry units with fire support in areas previously beyond Allied reach. British forces achieved a significant breakthrough when commandos from No. 3 Commando successfully captured the port facilities at Salerno itself. The operation, led by Lieutenant Colonel Peter Young, required careful coordination between naval support, air cover, and ground assault forces. The capture of the port allowed larger supply ships to begin unloading directly at dockside facilities rather than across the contested beaches. The most dramatic moment came when advance elements of the 5th Army made contact with reconnaissance units from Montgomery's 8th Army near Vallo della Lucania. This link-up, achieved after 6 days of brutal fighting, finally gave Allied forces a continuous front across southern Italy. The psychological impact on both Allied and German forces was enormous, as it became clear that the Salerno beachhead was now permanent. According to battlefield reports filed by war correspondents, including those from the Associated Press, German forces began conducting fighting withdrawals rather than the static defense that had characterized their earlier operations. This change in tactics reflected both their casualties and the recognition that the Allied position had become too strong to destroy through direct assault. German units maintained their discipline and fighting effectiveness, but they were clearly transitioning from offensive to defensive operations. The period from September 14th through 16th witnessed a series of Allied advances that pushed German forces back from their closest positions to the original landing beaches. American artillery finally landed in sufficient quantities, began counter-battery fire that neutralized many German guns that had made life miserable for Allied forces during the first week of fighting. The success at Salerno vindicated Allied strategic planning and demonstrated that American forces could successfully conduct major amphibious operations against determined German resistance. September 17th through 20th, 1943 marked the beginning of systematic Allied advances that would break the German grip on the high ground surrounding Salerno. General Mark Clark coordinated a series of carefully planned attacks designed to drive German forces away from their commanding positions while avoiding the costly frontal assaults that had characterized earlier fighting. The American Fifth Army had learned valuable lessons about German defensive tactics. It was now applying this knowledge effectively. The key to Allied success lay in the coordinated use of all available firepower. Naval guns, artillery, airstrikes, and tank support were synchronized to overwhelm German positions that had previously seemed impregnable. The USS Texas, arriving as reinforcement to the Naval Support Group, added her 14-inch guns to the massive firepower available to support ground operations. German forces, no matter how well positioned or determined, could not withstand such concentrated destruction. Colonel William Darby's Rangers spearheaded the assault on Monte Battaglia, a strategic height that dominated the entire Salerno plain. The attack required night movement across treacherous terrain, followed by a dawn assault up steep slopes against prepared German positions. Darby's men, trained in mountain warfare, used techniques developed in North Africa to approach German lines undetected. Their success in taking this key position opened the way for follow-up forces to advance inland. The German 16th Panzer Division, which had been the backbone of enemy resistance, found itself under constant pressure from multiple directions as Allied forces gained momentum. German tank crews, who had dominated early fighting with their superior equipment and tactics, now faced overwhelming numbers of Allied aircraft that could attack with relative impunity. The skies over Salerno, once contested, now belonged clearly to the Allies. Major General Ernest Harman's 1st Armored Division finally received permission to advance inland in force, bringing American tank warfare expertise to bear against German positions. Sherman tanks, supported by tank destroyers and infantry, began the methodical reduction of German strong points that artillery and air power had softened but not destroyed. Tank versus tank battles became less common as German armor withdrew to more defensible positions deeper inland. British 8th Army units advancing from the south maintained pressure that prevented German forces from concentrating against the Salerno beachhead. General Montgomery's methodical advance up the Italian peninsula forced the Germans to defend multiple fronts simultaneously, stretching their resources beyond the breaking point. The coordination between 5th and 8th Armies demonstrated how much Allied cooperation had improved since the early days of the war. As documented in official British military archives, German resistance began showing clear signs of weakening as ammunition shortages and personnel losses accumulated. Wehrmacht units that had fought with exceptional skill and determination during the first week of battle were now conducting delaying actions rather than attempting to hold fixed positions. The German military machine, effective as it was, could not indefinitely sustain the level of intensity required to stop a determined Allied advance, backed by superior resources. The capture of Altavilla on September 19th represented a significant psychological victory for American forces. This hill town had changed hands multiple times during the battle, with both sides recognizing its strategic importance. The final successful assault, conducted by elements of the 36th Infantry Division supported by Rangers and paratroopers, demonstrated how American tactical proficiency had improved through combat experience. Air superiority allowed Allied forces to operate during daylight hours with confidence. For the first time since the landing, German fighters, once numerous enough to contest control of the airspace, were now rarely seen over the battlefield. Allied bomber formations attacked German supply lines and reinforcement routes with devastating effectiveness, cutting the flow of materials needed to sustain defensive operations. The period also witnessed the first large-scale prisoner captures as German units found themselves cut off by rapidly advancing Allied forces. Intelligence gathered from captured soldiers revealed the extent of German casualties and the strain that continuous combat had placed on enemy units. Many prisoners expressed surprise at the intensity and effectiveness of Allied operations. having been told that American forces lacked the skill and determination to fight successfully against Wehrmacht veterans. By September 20th, it had become clear that German forces could no longer maintain their positions around Salerno and would be forced to withdraw to more defensible lines farther north. September 21st through 25th, 1943 witnessed the culmination of Allied success at Salerno as German forces began their general withdrawal northward toward defensive positions around Naples. General Heinrich von Weidenhoff's 10th Army conducted a skillful fighting retreat, but the strategic initiative had passed irreversibly to the Allied forces. The Battle of Salerno was effectively over, though fierce fighting would continue as German forces attempted to delay the Allied advance up the Italian peninsula. The final phase of the battle demonstrated the transformation of American military effectiveness that had occurred during the weeks of intense combat. Units that had struggled during the initial landing now advanced with confidence and skill, having learned through bitter experience how to fight German forces effectively. The 36th Infantry Division, composed largely of National Guard units from Texas, had proven that American citizen soldiers could match the Wehrmacht's professional army. When properly led and supported, General Mark Clark's 5th Army had grown from a precarious beachhead to a formidable fighting force controlling a front over 30 miles wide and extending 15 miles inland. The port of Salerno was fully operational, allowing large-scale supply operations that supported further advances. American logistics, once viewed skeptically by British allies, had demonstrated remarkable efficiency in maintaining combat operations under difficult conditions. The naval aspects of the Salerno operation established precedents for future Allied amphibious operations. Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham's coordination of naval gunfire support had proven that warships could provide effective artillery support for ground forces, even against heavily fortified positions. The lessons learned at Salerno would prove invaluable during the planning for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy scheduled for 1944. German casualties during the Battle of Salerno exceeded 15,000 men, including significant losses among elite units like the Hermann Göring Panzer Division and various SS formations. These losses, coming after heavy fighting in Sicily and concurrent with massive casualties on the Eastern Front, represented a significant drain on German military manpower. More importantly, the defeat at Salerno demonstrated that German forces could not prevent Allied landings on European soil when properly supported by air and naval power. The psychological impact of success at Salerno extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation for American forces. The victory proved that they could successfully conduct complex operations against determined German resistance. The confidence gained through this success would sustain Allied forces through the difficult Italian campaign that lay ahead for German forces. Salerno represented another strategic defeat that revealed the growing weakness of their position in southern Europe. Allied casualties totaled approximately 13,000 men, with American forces bearing the majority of losses due to their role in the initial assault. These casualties, while significant, were considerably lighter than pessimistic pre-invasion estimates that had predicted much higher losses given the strength of German defenses. The relatively moderate casualty figures reflected both improved Allied tactics and the effectiveness of supporting firepower. The strategic consequences of the Salerno victory extended throughout the Mediterranean and European theaters. Italian surrender, announced during the early days of the battle, became a reality as Allied forces controlled sufficient territory to support Italian government forces willing to change sides. German resources that might have been used elsewhere were now committed to defending the Italian peninsula against continued Allied advances. According to post-war analysis by military historians, the Battle of Salerno marked a crucial turning point in Allied capability to conduct large-scale amphibious operations. The successful establishment and defense of the beachhead under extreme pressure validated the strategic concept of opening additional fronts in occupied Europe. This validation provided crucial support for political leaders like Churchill and Roosevelt, who advocated aggressive Allied strategy despite the enormous risks involved. The victory at Salerno opened the path toward Rome and demonstrated that Hitler's fortress Europe could be breached through determined Allied action. While the Italian campaign would prove long and costly, requiring nearly 2 more years of fighting to reach final victory, the success at Salerno established that Allied forces possessed both the capability and the will to carry the war directly to German-occupied territory. The young Americans who had struggled ashore on September 9, 1943, had proven themselves worthy inheritors of their nation's military tradition and had taken the first crucial step toward the liberation of Europe.